All right, praising God again, once again, for not only progress, but for his practical insights as we look at Romans chapter 14. Let's call it peace because that term is going to come up twice. I think once in verse 17 and then again in verse 19. But I also want to subtitle it Cats for an illustration that I think might help us understand the role that peace plays in this chapter. That, once again, I'm going to borrow the structure that we used in the sermon that I preached not too long ago on this topic. And I'm not going to go verse by verse or even paragraph by paragraph. What I want to do is look at four concepts that recur in this chapter. Two are going to have to do with mindset. Two are going to have to do with the deeds that seem to proceed from our mind and our heart, much like we saw in previous chapters. Paul seems to be using this recurring pattern of talking about the mindset and the deeds it produces in us. Once again, he's going to do that here in chapter 14 that talks about quarreling over opinions. As we talked about in the sermon, two things that he's going to talk about regarding mindset are despising one another over differences of opinions and then passing judgment against one another over differences of opinion. That whole concept of despising coming up in verse 3 where it says, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, understanding that his illustration is food sacrificed to idols or differences of opinion over what we can and cannot eat. Concept of despising again will come up in verse 10 where he says, or why do you despise your brother? Once again, attitude towards one another. But he also talks about passing judgment on one another. Back up in verse 3. Let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats. Again in verse 4. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? As he is again going to mention that in verse 10. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Verse 13, giving us the same thing, as he is then going to combine the whole concept of mindset to the way we begin to treat one another. In verse 13, he's going to say, therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or a hindrance in the way of a brother. Now seeing the way in which our attitudes can manifest in basically getting in one another's way. So he's again going to talk about that whole concept of now beginning to put a stumbling block or an encumbrance in one another's way. Again in verse 20 where he's going to say, do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything indeed is clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble in what he eats. Again in verse 21, it is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. And we've already kind of mentioned in reading the verses about stumbling, that fourth concept that he is going to mention, meaning going beyond simply causing someone to stumble, the whole concept of eventually doing the kinds of things that can actually destroy a person is something he is cautioning us against in lost track of it, which verse, Marcus? Verse 15. It says, for if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. By what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died. Likewise, verse 20, do not for the sake of food, as we already mentioned, destroy the work of God. And really, those concepts are structurally how we look at the chapter, the whole concept of not despising and passing judgment, setting us up in the kind of mindset that will eventually lead us to do the kinds of things that cause another person to stumble or eventually be destroyed in being emboldened to do things that are basically risky or dangerous or detrimental. So in life, if we take it out of the realm of food sacrificed to idols, sometimes people can get themselves in trouble trying to emulate the things that we do, things that we feel free to do, even if they are completely okay for us. Simple example, I might become friends with somebody who's cool and competent and skilled and walking a high wire, but to the degree I get bold enough to want to try that myself, if I go too far too soon, I can fall off of that high wire and not just hurt myself, but I can potentially get, exactly. And so that's what he's talking about on a spiritual level. It's not always that easy to see the way in which we are doing things in our own freedom that are actually encouraging people to take on risks unnecessarily. And so the theme that stood out for me in this chapter, as we mentioned, comes from verses 17 and 19, where he says, in our relationship with one another and flexing our freedoms, do it in a way that looks out for the best interest of a brother or a sister, a theme he's going to pick up again in chapter 15. But here he's simply going to say in verse 19, So then let us pursue what makes for peace and mutual upbuilding, as opposed to encouraging one another to do the kinds of things that risk not only our safety, but potentially our very lives. But with that, one of the things that are implicit in this chapter, at least to me, that I want to go ahead and take some liberties on, you can take it or leave it, is going back to the beginning of the chapter where the whole context of chapter 14 is disputing over opinions, which reminded me of the old saying, you are entitled to your own opinions, but you are not entitled to your own facts. And so when this chapter seems to, for me, at least thematically, emphasize that whole concept of pursuing peace, when you put that in the context of your opinions, one of the things that seems to be required in pursuing peace with regard to our opinions is also pursuing truth. The reason why the illustration of cats seemed appropriate is it's one thing if we are all content to have our opinions and simply just label them, oh, that's just my opinion, but we don't take on the responsibility to ensure that our opinions are completely consistent with facts. Then we can all take our opinions and head off in different directions, like the proverbial effort to herd cats. The whole concept of herding cats is basically good luck with that because they don't herd so well because they all kind of do their own thing. And that's not what Paul is cautioning us to do here when he says, pursue the things that make for peace. A concept that's not all that different from something he is going to write in a later epistle when he says, he encourages us to all be of the same mind. Even more close to home, it's a concept he's going to build on in chapter 15 as he says, beyond pursuing the things that make for peace, he's going to say, bear one another's burdens and even more, being an encouragement to one another, which is why we often say God's best to you as you go forward with him. God willing, pursuing the things that make for peace, by taking on the added responsibility of genuinely pursuing the truth.